welcome everyone to our very last Friday Facts of the year. This is exciting. The North Carolina Serious Illness Coalition, we're super excited to have Steve Stonecypher, the Triad Regional Coordinator for Carolina Aging Alliance. So welcome everyone. And we will get together next week for our monthly meeting, December 16th. And then we won't have another Friday Facts until January 13th. So I'm excited to see many of you next week. I'm excited for this Friday Facts. But this is a great way to end the year. One quick announcement. Thank you for everyone that participated and are joining our Voices Symposium. The recordings are now up online. They're wonderful. I've gone and looked at them. So if any of you, your friends, your family, anyone's missed any of the recordings or want to watch them again as I have, please go to the website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shane. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Heather, so much. Good morning, everybody. Excited today for our guest, Steve Stonecypher, Regional Coordinator for Carolina Aging Alliance. We're excited to have a conversation today about LGBTQ plus inclusion in our communities and the work that he's doing with the Carolina Aging Alliance. So, Steve, it would be great for people to get to know a little about you before we talk about your wonderful work with the Aging Alliance. You grew up like I did, and kind of in the West, where there were no real models of any LGBTQ plus people living out the fullness of their lives. Was there a moment or an experience that gave you a picture of what aging as an LGBTQ plus person might look like?
Well, I mean, I think like many people, it's sort of a novel. Right. And we all have chapters in our lives and we live those out. But for me, I think there was two pieces here that I would, number one, dealing with my sexuality. Right. So first you're dealing with that. But then for me, I didn't see the connection because I've always felt older, or as they say, one of the older than I actually am from who I connect with. And so having that sort of dynamic, there really wasn't that visualization of people in those types of situations. So there were always whispers of people, oh, he's gay or she's gay, but there was never anybody there that you could feel comfortable with going and talking to. So even though I grew up on the West, which was probably more liberal than obviously people who grew up in the Midwest or in a more rural areas, there still was never that sort of role model or someone, because what we saw on TV was always the very feminine or ones that people made fun of historically. So where it really sort of came to a head for me was when my partner became ill, and he was older than I was, and I did not see resources available in the community, or I didn't know where to go to get those resources. So that became a sort of stepping off point where I knew it was time for me to start really, I would say coming out of the closet, but at least coming forward so that people saw others who were, had been successful in their careers, had been successful in life, that they could use those individuals as role models. So I don't know if there was one particular point in time. I think it's just been a process and a story that in a life that I'm living.
Well, as you lived in different places across the country, right? Do you want to share a little bit about what those experiences were like? Because as you said, grew up in the West Coast. Certainly some of the more progressive sides of the movement were in places like LA, but you've lived in a few places. Did you see a difference as you were, living in different cities and different regions?
Well, when I was on the West Coast, I went to school, and my first thought was, I'm just going to keep going to school, right? I did a undergraduate, then I went back, thought I wanted to go to med school. So I went through that process, and I thought I'd just keep postponing this sort of decision tree that I had to go through, just keep pushing it down the line. And in California, I never really, I saw it, I heard rumors, but I never really dealt with it. It wasn't till I left and I moved to Houston, living in another big city, and sort of fell into a community there just by happenstance. It wasn't anything I was looking for. It just, I couldn't continue to push that decision down the road, couldn't keep kicking the proverbial can. So I found a very inclusive community, or a community that was accepting of me there. And so that was sort of the beginning of the process for me to really start to, explore and to see what was out there. But again, it's still been this 30-year process, right? It's a little, where I've had these conversations with other individuals, and they say, "Oh yeah, I came out of the womb, I knew." Well, I knew, but I didn't deal, right? I didn't want, I guess it was still the perception of what society expected.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's sort of been that process.
thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting in a way too. We talked a little bit about lack of role models. HIV had a major impact on,
Oh, absolutely.
essentially sort of taking a whole generation away. We had so many different transitions. I remember growing up that the scariest thing as a young queer person was, to be 35 at the bar, right? To be
Right.
that because there wasn't a model of what that looked like. How did you, as you were younger, and you were processing all of these things, can you reflect a little bit about what that was like? Because I think a lot of people don't understand that we did not see an older generation in that.
Right. Well, and in fact, that I think was part of what stunted my sort of growth into my being, right? Because when I was in school and college, that was one of the first things I did. I took a course in epidemiology, and I did a study on AIDS and HIV. And so that actually pushed me back further, because it scared me, saying that, look, number one, to your point, no role models. All those people were dying or becoming ill. But I also realized that, okay, is this going to be the pathway that is my path forward? So I actually kind of withdrew as a result of that. And I think it sort of stunted my maturation or process of acceptance. And so with all these experiences, I can understand, and we'll get to this, but some of the people in our group who are coming out in their 70s, I mean, and I can understand, and I can have empathy for that. People who have, whether it's culturally, whether it's religiously, or whatever reason, that have waited to become their true selves. So, and I can understand that, because there's always things that are in front of us, but it's again how we deal with them.
That's really powerful. No, I appreciate that. And you mentioned obviously the group. So as you talk about different people and their journeys and their novels, right?
Right.
The Carolina Aging Alliance grew out of SAGE, which everyone might not be familiar with. Could you share a little bit about SAGE, what drew you to the organization, maybe how it evolved to the Carolina Aging Alliance today?
Well, so SAGE USA is a national organization that's been around for 40 plus years, based out of New York City. And their goal is to support, and they've gone through a number of sort of changes, but it's the end goal for them is to support older LGBTQ adults. And so over the last couple of years, what they've really, they had what they called affiliates. So there were organizations across the country that were branded as SAGE, and they had to go through a process, contractual process, to be able to provide education, advocacy, and social opportunities for older LGBTQ adults. So what they've also realized is there wasn't as much push or growth into the BIPOC community. So what they're doing is sort of retooling those programs. So we're still, Carolina Aging Alliance is a rebranding of SAGE Central North Carolina, and it's still affiliated with SAGE USA. And so all the affiliates now are rebranding. So the organization, which used to be called SAGE of the Cape Fear Coast in Wilmington, is now called the Owls. And so it's under the center. So it's an acronym for, and Ed will get mad at me if I get this wrong. I think it's Out Wilmington LGBTQ Seniors. So that's their acronym. So OWL, wisdom. So I mean, you can play that. So all of them are rebranding, but they're still affiliated with SAGE USA, and so they're in that process. So all the former SAGE groups will now have that on the website. But SAGE continues to support through, they work with AARP on senior, specific areas that they want to address. And all of these really are to promote the acceptance or the understanding of what LGBT older adults need as they age.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Could you share maybe a couple I guess of the challenges that you feel like SAGE and Carolina Aging Alliance are focused on?
Yeah, I mean, so Sage Central North Carolina typically was in the triangle, right? So in the triad where I am, Greensboro, High Point, Winston-Salem, we started as initially just a 50+ adult group in sort of creating social opportunities. So as we've aligned with SAGE, or now Carolina Aging Alliance, what we're seeing is one, resources for people, organizations who are inclusive, so that individuals who maybe are in a long-term relationship, maybe they're married, maybe they're not married, and helping organizations understand how to approach them, and don't say, who are you married to? You said who's important to you, because a lot of people may be disaffiliated with their biological family, so now they have a chosen family. So these type, using words carefully is important, but also creating the ability for individuals who are in the community to understand what organizations are inclusive. Who can they go to and not have to tell their story. So it's not even a question. It's it's just a part of who they are. And so these are all the bits, in providing educational opportunities, aligning with organizations like AARP and the Alzheimer's Association, all these different organizations, and how we can work together to make sure that the community is aware of these organizations, and the organizations are aware of the community and where they can go for resources.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And there are still so many people in their 40s and older, like me, that are reflecting and sort of sharing parts of their gender and sexual identity and expression in new ways that might not have expected. Earlier in their lives, like this may not be the story that they thought they were going to do. Ways that are sometimes confident and maybe sometimes uncertain. Serious illness care experts and providers, the coalition members, want to be able to affirm an individual's journey. Do you have recommendations? You mentioned just now, ways to frame a conversation around who's important to you, which is really powerful. Do you have any recommendations from your own experience and from the experience of your husband's end of life journey that maybe can help coalition members better respond to and ensure inclusion in care practices?
Well, I mean, I think it's never a matter of who is this person, but just making, if they're there, they're most likely important to that person. And then as you sort of build that rapport, is trying to understand what that relationship is. But it's typically just, I think, the types of questions and the words that are used within the questions. And again, and I'll go back to that, who's important to you, right? That's because it may not be the biological family. And look, obviously there's legal aspects to this, via HIPAA and all that, and making sure that you are doing as a healthcare provider, obviously what that patient wishes, but and trying to be as transparent with them as possible, and vice versa, and letting them know and making them feel comfortable that it's okay, and that's part of it. Is a lot of older people, these are people who have fought to get us where we are today, sometimes have to go back in the closet when they move into communities. And so as a community and organization, it's making them feel inclusive, the same as you would with someone who's a Christian versus someone who might be Jewish versus someone who might celebrate Kwanzaa, or all these different individuals. And that's the way you would think about someone and their sexuality.
That's really powerful. So when you're talking about inclusive practices, is there any insight around trans inclusive practices? Because I know you mentioned before that some people have to go into the closet. There can be and for those of you who are not familiar with it, in the closet just means individuals who do not disclose their identity, sometimes out of fear for repercussion. So sometimes they mask a particular part of themselves to make sure that they are safe. And for trans people who enter into care and long-term care, especially serious illness care, there can be conflicting pieces with medications. There can be other things.
Right.
Are there conversations or ways that the Carolina Aging Alliance is having those conversations and encouraging that amongst care facilities?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the trans community, there, I mean, it's like you said, it's really there's multiple factors here. Obviously, it's not only sexual identity, sexual orientation, it's gender identity, and so there's a lot of factors playing here, and typically most, and I won't say all, but most healthcare organizations continue to do what they need to do medically. A lot of times it ends up being the residents and others where they find sort of more of that pushback because of, it's a different generation. They may not have been around individuals, but as far as education, we're actually in the process right now of putting together a survey, and this is going to be in the Greater Triad, putting together a survey to healthcare providers to say, how can we support you? Do you feel comfortable that you have an inclusive environment? If not, can we come in and help you educate not only your providers, maybe even your residents, those that are willing to have an open mind and have those discussions. So we're really trying to be an organization that can promote inclusivity to all organizations and all individuals, and then helping people to understand. And maybe it's starting with the basics of, what is a pronoun, and why it's important, and starting there, and then sort of building how to support individuals.
For those who may not be familiar, do you mind explaining a little bit for people who might not be familiar with pronouns and why this is the key piece?
Well, I mean, pronouns really are, how you see yourself, how you identify. So me, I would say I'm he, him, meaning I'm a man who identifies as a man. But, you may have those who, female, who's a female biologically, identifies as a female, she, her. But then you have some that are what we call non-binary. Those that, easiest way to say is it's sort of ebb and flow, right? It's how they feel. They don't really identify either male or female, or they identify both. And so they're sort of what they would say non-binary. So they might use the pronouns they, them. So and there's even more. It gets, there's beyond that. But those are the base. It's really about how you identify and how you see yourself, and how you want other people to see you and identify you. And so it's important, because when you have people who are expressing maybe a non traditional gender identity, in those situations, you can ask them, and most people are happy if you ask them, say, how do you want me to address you? It's not making the assumption that it's a he or a she, or it's a that. They may say, oh, call me they. That's my pronoun. And so it's really asking them, how would you prefer I address you? And especially, and this goes back to, Shane, your question about in the trans community, how would you want me to address you? Because I just watched this. It was really, really interesting. It was on Netflix, and it was called Disclosure. And one of the key individuals on there was Laverne Cox. And she talks about her transition and being in New York City. And she said, oh, it was a mess. She goes, and she would walk down the city, and people would make comments when she was transitioning from male to female, and people would make comments and understand that that's a process for everybody that goes through that, that identifies as a different gender than they were born with. So asking someone how they want to identify, and how do you want me to address you? Is it, and don't say, who were you before? I mean, those type questions really can be, offensive to them. So you just leave it open ended and say, how should I address you?
That's
Let
really
them
powerful.
tell you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's again, sage advice. I think for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you say? I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with sort of the again, these conversations may not also recognize that there's a lot of generational conflict
Oh, absolutely.
in communities around whether it's pronoun usage or just broader terms like queer, so on and so forth.
Yep.
Are you seeing that within aging
Yeah.
communities who are, reconciling some of this? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Because I think maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with that.
Well, the younger generation, is, I won't say to use the word militant, but is more, they've grown up in a different worldview than, let's say, I did, or even the older generation prior to me. And so they're going to be who they are. And so their thought is the word queer identifies us as a whole, and we're going to take that word back. So they are embracing that word as identifying the community. Whereas me personally, I'm struggling with the word, because it to me still identifies growing up as it was a derogatory term. The older generation is even doing the same. So they struggle with that, and that's a bridge that's going to have to be, built for the two generations to really come together. But also in the pronoun, and think about, the gay rights movement. Who started that, right? That was started by somewhat, at the time, they called transvestites, or the transgendered individuals were the ones that were really pushing, who started this. And through that process, they sort of, I won't say, got the gay rights movement moved forward for gay, lesbian, but really didn't for the trans community. They were sort of, and so now, with pronouns. And so my point here is that the older generation still is struggling with some of the pronouns and the pronouns usage, but there's a lot of individuals who are really, trying to understand why it's important. But you also have to look at it in the context of how they grew up and how the community sort of evolved over the last 40 years.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think people, don't always recognize that so much changed over 40 years. That, that's a lot of public shift. It's a lot of personal shift for individuals. There were a couple comments in here that I thought was really powerful. I just want to read these, and obviously, if people have questions for Steve, please include those in here. Katie shared that in our health system, we found that non-providers need more education and resources than providers, echoing your point. That it is, again, individuals who might be in a care facility who might have maybe a little bit more homophobia and transphobia, or maybe not enough education around inclusive practices. And then Heather also, again, illustrated your point, not to use the term queer, for example, with older adults, as it can be traumatic. Like you said, some people may have grown up. It's a derogatory term. It was used as a slur early on, but has been reclaimed over the last several years, again, kind of just demonstrating some of that generational divide. And again, if anybody has any questions, please include those in chat. The last weeks in North Carolina, as well as across the country, have echoed historic violence that LGBTQ people have long faced. So again, kind of echoing a little bit Heather's point. From hate crimes on the street to employment discrimination, of course, most recently the transphobic fueled vandalism and vitriol that we see in Monroe County, that happened this last week. So many people I met over the years felt that acceptance and affirmation represented on TV was translating at all levels of society. But I'd love to know your thoughts on this, and in organizing to support aging LGBTQ plus North Carolinians who witnessed these events, perhaps even surfacing some of these traumas. How do you think our communities and the coalition allies might respond in their work and their neighborhoods to change that and really fight transphobia and homophobia?
Well, I think it's like any kind of hatred. Right. If you hide from it, run from it, then you let them win. So the best way that communities and providers can support, and this is for any, whether it's LGBT, whether it's minority communities, any community, is to be a part and engage with those communities and be supportive. So continuing to, I won't say do as usual, but it's with caution, but continue to live your life and be your authentic self, because if not, then they win just by default. And what happened in here in North Carolina, and obviously reading more, that wasn't the first, and it will not be the last. But it's again supporting those organizations. And when you hear individuals make derogatory comments, just that's not acceptable. You know, if that's your personal opinion, I'm not here to change your opinion, but I'm here to tell you, around me, that's not acceptable. And so eventually, if they start to hear that enough, maybe they'll start to actually step back and say, well, okay, what am I doing wrong? And they'll start to think about where they stand. So I think that's part of it. So, and it takes not just individuals, but it takes an entire community to push and move forward. And that's what we really need to continue to do.
Thank you. No, it's absolutely, again, really powerful. And I think, you know, I know we're finishing up here in a few minutes, but, you know, Harold Barnett is on with us, and if I may honor something that he shared in a previous conversation, you know, there's a lot of systems and structures that reinforce racism and reinforce bias within it. Are there ways that, again, coalition members can look at those systems? Is that something that Carolina Aging, you know, that essentially Carolina Aging Alliance can I guess reinforce or encourage that some of these systems that are in place, whether that's pronoun usage, but also some more, you know, deeper operational pieces, can that be something that we encourage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're trying to look at ways, not only with, you know, healthcare providers, but with the state at, you know, North Carolina Department of Aging, and how, you know, the local community, whether it's senior resources or and this, you know, goes along those lines. But I mean, there are so many built-in areas that create, whether it's racism, you know, homophobia, transphobia, they're sort of built in. And I think not only starting at the local level, you know, just like anything that's a grassroots effort, how do we start at the local level to make sure that this stops locally and then continue to go to the state level, federal level. But I think there are a lot of organizations who are pushing at this from so many different directions, you know, and you know, obviously with the overturning of basically DOMA, you know, and so it's a big step. And there was two pieces there, obviously allowing interracial marriages as well as same-sex marriages, so that, you know, again, it's that starting it at all levels. And so we as Carolina Aging Alliance are not only working locally, but we're now trying to work more statewide, and with our group in Raleigh, getting engaged with, you know, the Coalition on Aging and various other organizations that support to make the LGBTQ community part of the conversation. And you know, right now that's part of what our ask is, you know, if you're going to be talking about older adults, let's make sure that we're at the table and that we can be part of the conversation.
Thank you. No, absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And we love the Coalition on Aging. We're proud to be partners with them in many ways.
Yeah.
So thank you again so much. Anything else you want to add? You know, we're about to close up our time, Steve. I just want to say thank you again so much for sharing your experience, for sharing what the Coalition on Aging, Carolina Aging Alliance is doing. I think I'm excited for coalition members to stay in contact with you, certainly, and making sure that we are working in coalition together. So I really appreciate that. So anything you want to say?
No, just would love to work with you guys in whatever capacity. You know, there's me here in the triad, and then my counterpart Joe in the triangle. So there's two of us, and then Ed down in Wilmington with the owl. So we're getting close to having complete state coverage, which is great. But there are a lot of great organizations who do support the LGBTQ community, and would love to get engaged.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for being here today. We look forward to staying in community with you and continue to do this work.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.